continue
wherever He will lead us, away from cleaning up all of our ills and into a spirit of gratitude for the healing graces that our family and friends
Now I don't know if there'll be snow, but have a cup of cheer.
There you go, Nico. Get him. Get him.
Great job. That was the best, and that's why you guys had the best performance. But now we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna give some shout outs to the people that actually sent me pictures of them in pajamas. And we're gonna have a contest. You guys are gonna vote in the comments. You guys let me know who deserves or who has the best pajamas, and you let me know, and they will win a prize. So here we go. Here are our contestants.
Today I don't feel like doing anything. Just wanna lay in my
Carolyn?
bed. Feel like picking
Is it
up my
Alina?
phone, so leave a message tone. 'Cause today
Emily?
I swear I'm not doing anything. I'm gonna kick my
Christian?
feet up, then stare at the fan. Turn the TV on, throw my hands. Nobody's gonna tell me I can't.
Yvette?
Lounging on the couch, just chilling in my snuggie. Click to MTV so they can teach me how to Dougie. Yeah, so I'm
Juan Skellington?
oh yes I
Or is it the one and only Jesus?
can. Today I don't feel like
Or is it Jade? So those were the participants for today. Thank you guys for sending me those photos. It was really cool. So don't forget, vote for who you think has the best PJs. Just vote for them all, actually, because they all did it and they all deserve a prize. So thank you guys. Alright, so yesterday we talked about the city of Florence and how the city of Florence became the birthplace of the Renaissance. And it all became because Florence became like this model city. And the reason why it became a model city is because it became really, really wealthy. And the reason why it became wealthy was because of the trade, because of the wool, and also because they had this really, really wealthy ruler. And remember, the most wealthy families were ruling these cities, and these cities were used to go ahead and use the wealth to beautify and to see who can create the best city. So, what happened was this city was owned and ruled by this guy named Cosimo Medici. And Medici was his banker, and they made money off loaning money to people and charging them interest, getting more money. And we did this. He loved the arts, and he wanted to beautify everybody. So he started to bring back the arts, and he started to bring back the culture. So since he loved this, he wanted to bring it all back, and they started this thing called the Renaissance. And the Renaissance was called like the rebirth. So he was hiring artists to paint things. He was hiring architects to build new Roman buildings. So he started to bring this all back, and Florence became the main city. Today we are going to talk about something different. We're going to talk about how, since Florence started, how it started to spread throughout all of Italy, and how Italy started to have this new idea of thinking, and that's what we're going to talk about today. All right, so number one, how did Florence help begin the Renaissance? So Florence, they helped at the beginning of the Renaissance because they became the center of arts, literature, and culture. And because of this, all this new love and spark back for the loves of this art, literature, and culture, it started this whole new thing, and this is the city that began it all. And it was all thanks to the Medici family, who had all the money to fund all these artists. Number two, why was education so important to Cosmo Medici? Education was so important for Cosmo Medici because, remember, he wanted educated people to work in his city. He needed educated people to work in the banks, and he wanted educated people to translate literature, create art, and build these buildings. Number three, how did Florence rise to fame? So Florence, the reason why they were able to rise to fame is because of them being the center of art, literature, and culture. Because of this, and because they became one of the most wealthy cities, Florence was like the city that everyone wanted to beat. It was like the best city, and they wanted to go ahead, and they were like the front runners. They were the ones that showed everybody this is how a city should be, and this is what the arts and the culture can do to your city. So like I said, today we're going to talk about the Italian Renaissance, starting a whole new section. But for today's objective, we're going to be able to explain how during the Italian Renaissance, how did people start to see this new world. So we're going to explain how people in Italy started to see the world in a different lens, or started to think of the world differently because of this Renaissance. So let's go ahead and get to it. So the Renaissance period brought new ways of thinking. People began to value individuals and their personal achievements. This was a big change from the way people thought during the Middle Ages, when everyone was pretty much working for the king. Now people felt like they can do things what they wanted. And this started to open up the eyes to all these new ideas, and it changed the way people thought. So during the Middle Ages, most people in Europe had devoted themselves entirely to Christianity. Remember, the church was everything. Whatever the church said, that's what they did. Whatever the church does, this is what we're doing. We're only doing what the church wanted. So during this time, people started to look at the church for answers for problems in their lives, and most of Europe's brilliant, influential thinkers were church figures, and we all know this, and it was because they didn't really want to be excommunicated or whatnot. But however, when the Renaissance started in the late 1300s, scholars had begun to study subjects besides religion. Remember, they started to open up these universities, and they started to think about other things. And they studied history, they studied literature, they studied public speaking and arts. All these different subjects emphasize the actions and the abilities of different humans. So people started to think like, well, we can actually do things and learn things on our own. So with all these subjects, when you add them all together, history, literature, speaking, arts, this is what we call humanities. And the subject of humanities is the study of, or when they start to study all these different things, they start to develop new ideas, and this led to a new way of thinking and learning, and this became known as humanism. So just like we talked about before we left school, we did talk about how all these new how learning all these new subjects changed life, and it's because they start to see things differently. They start to educate themselves and coming up with their own ideas. Just like when you guys learn something, you all have learn the same things, but you guys all have different abilities. Just think of like video games, when you think of different ways to do things or different way to create art. Everyone could think their own way because everyone's influenced differently, because we're all different. And that's what these people started to see the world as. They started to see it as individuals. Like, just because one person sees it this way, it doesn't mean I need to see it that way. We can all see it differently. So the people that believed in this humanities, or this new study of humanism, were called humanists. And the humanists of the Renaissance were no less religious than people had before. So these people were still religious, but they just had other ideas now. So like the people in the Middle Ages, they were devout or devoted Christians. At the same time, however, people in the Renaissance were interested in ideas besides religion. They wanted to open up their mind. So these people's newfound interest in the humanities led them to respect those who could write, create, and speak as well. So now all these creators, they became like, oh, I want to be a creator. I can be these people. I want to be these people, and I look up to these people that are actually doing this. Just like us. We all like music, but we really like certain artists. Or we like different people that play sports. We look up to them because they can do it. So because of this, talented writers and artists, they became very famous, and this is when we start to really see like people admire other people for their works. This was a huge change from the Middle Ages, because most people had only worked to glorify God, but now people are going to start to do things because they realize people like them and they adore what they're doing. So now people aren't just thinking about God. Now they're thinking about how can we influence other people with our arts and our ideas. So one thing that made the humanities really popular was because of the new interest in ancient history. During this time, they started to translate texts. They started to rediscover a lot of these ancient writings that Europeans thought that were gone. And because of all this, when they were rewriting it and reviving all these writings, a lot of these classical Greek works or the Roman works, they started to have a newfound love for these ancient works. Just like when we learn about history, maybe you learn something and you get a new spark of interest because you're learning something about the past. So during the 1300s, the Turks, they conquered much of the Byzantine Empire, which was in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, and scholars seeking to escape the Turks fled to Italy. And when they left to Italy, in their luggage, these scholars carried rare, precious works of literature, things that were dear to them, and they brought it all to Italy. Many of these works that were brought to Italy were ancient classical writings, such as the ones from Greek writers. You may remember some of these names like Plato, Aristotle, all these different philosophers. And Europeans had thought that these ancient writings were gone forever because no one's seen these ancient texts in a really long time. Since they saw them, they were super excited that they returned, and the scholars went looking for more texts and they started to translate them in Latin. When they discovered that a lot of these texts were in Latin, these monks started to preserve the works by and spreading them throughout everybody. So as Italian scholars read the ancient texts, they rediscovered the glories of the Greeks and the Romans, and as a result, they renewed for all this classical culture. So this searching and translating all this text brought back history. Just think about like when you're young and look at all your baby pictures, you get excited again. You're like, oh, I remember when I was a kid or whatnot. And that's kind of like how it is, okay? So among these ideas of the Italian cultures, they wanted to revive were the subjects that the Greeks and Romans studied. So they wanted to bring back grammar, they wanted to bring back poetry, they wanted to bring back history, and a lot of these different Greek and Latin languages, and it all shaped humanities. Okay. Other ancient sources of inspiration for the Renaissance artists and architects were all around. The Roman ruins were still there, so they can still go out to the architecture. They just started to have a newfound love, and they started to look at things differently. So they started to look at these classical statues. They started to remake these statues. They started to study these statues, and what do these statues have to tell us? What does this art have to tell us? In fact, some of these artists, they wanted their works to look just look ancient like they were. So these artists started to recreate and model a lot of their works after the Greeks and the Romans. So you have to remember, during the Italian Renaissance, this is a cool important fact, is that a lot of the Roman statues, they weren't originals, they're all copies, and they made them to bring back the Greeks' works. So if you ever go to Rome or Italy, don't get confused with all their statues, because they're actually all remakes of the Greek statues, and they're not originals. But they remade them because, remember, they were so in love with this culture and this newfound culture that they wanted to remake everything. So they fell in love with their history or their past again. So as a quick review, throughout the Middle Ages, most people devoted their time and pretty much dedicated their whole lives to the church. But when they started to educate themselves, they started to think of other things and started to have ideas of their own. And this kind of led to this Italian Renaissance. And they began to study subjects such as history, literature, public speaking, and art. And all these subjects combined created this thing called humanities, and which led to this thing called humanism. And this was just a new way of thinking about the world, like thinking that people are individuals, people can do things for themselves, and we want to get back to our roots or to our history. We're still going to be devoted to God, but we're also going to think of things of our own. So this is when a lot of people started to do things, and artists became popular, writers became popular, and this is like kind of like when we start to see celebrities start to show up. one thing that was pretty cool was that when these Turkish people were coming in from the Byzantine Empire, they brought a lot of these ancient works that they thought were lost forever to Italy. And when the Italians found this out, they were amazed and they loved it. And they got back to their roots and they started to go back and read about the Greek history, the Roman history. They started to translate the text. And because of this, they fell in love with their past again. And they wanted to recreate all this. So they wanted to recreate the works. They started to make art that recreated the history of this. And pretty much they started to do things like that. And because of this led to a whole new way of thinking, and people became a little bit more independent and a little bit more away from the church and realized that we are humans, we're individuals, we all have talents, and we can think for ourselves. So for homework, I want you to answer these questions. These questions may be a little confusing, but I'll help you out and give you some hints. Number one, what sources inspired Renaissance artists? So think about what the Turks brought, think about what inspired the people and these artists. Number two, why is the word human contained in humanism? Think about their new way of thinking. Remember, they used to think about only the church, but now they start to think about individuals. So why do you think the word human was in this word? So think about that and think about why they thought this. And number three, what are some basic ideas of humanism? Remember, a lot of these people, they were doing things to glorify God, but then they started to do things that were not for God, and people started to admire different things and started to admire people. So what are some things that were the ideas of humanism? Remember, humanism is they started to have this new way of thinking and learning where people were more independent, people were themselves, so they can do things and they can be acknowledged for their accomplishments. So why do you think this new idea of thinking was so popular about this and this new revival of self and human beings and being an individual? Why is this all important? All right, so that concludes today's lesson about humanism. Like I said, humanism is about individuals. So people were getting acknowledged for their individual accomplishments, and people were becoming famous because they're great artists, writers, and statue makers, or anything like that, historians. So this was this new way of thinking where they don't just have to do things for God, and it's not all about the church. We can start doing things on our own, kind of like us today. We do things and we're acknowledged for our independent accomplishments. So if you have any questions, please let me know. And thanks for those who sent pictures of the photos, sent photos of you in your PJs. Today is Christmas Day, so I want to see you guys in some Christmas outfits. And if you have any questions, just send me a message. Don't forget, tomorrow we are having a Zoom session at 10 a.m. and you can bring your pets with yourselves in the Zoom. So looking forward to seeing you guys all tomorrow. See you guys later.